All right, welcome back to Beyond the Protocol. I'm so excited for my guest today and this topic. I think it's going to be a really great show and discussion. So, today we are de risking clinical trials and discussing what high performing teams get right. And my guest, Suzanne Vyvoda, is with me today. And I'm not even going to attempt to introduce you. I'm going to let you take it away and introduce yourself because I think having you on the show and being able to have a discussion from your viewpoint, and the role that you have in operations and clinical trials is just really going to be insightful for the guests that listen in today. So take it away. I'd love to hear about you and how you got started.
Sure. Well, Melody, it's a pleasure to be here. Suzanne Vyvoda, and I've had 20 plus years now working in clinical trials, clinical trial operations. And I think some of what makes my background a little unique is that I started out as a clinical research coordinator. So I've spent time on the site side. I had time on the CRO side as well. I went from site to CRO and then to sponsor. So what makes my background unique is that I've had to sort of see how this industry works from those three different vantage points. And so my approach to things, I really try to lead from that 360-degree view. What is going to, what is happening at the site, what is the CRO's standpoint, and then, of course, folding that back into the sponsor. So I've now been on the sponsor side for 12, 15 years now or so. I've worked at big companies, I've worked at teeny tiny startups, I've led teams of people across the globe on massive phase 3 clinical trials.
Mhm.
I've done first in human trials, of course, that are much, much smaller. And a little bit of everything in between. And I think my ethos to that has been to try to have experiences that are broad based. So site CRO sponsor, yes, but different therapy areas, different
Mhm.
types of companies, different phases of trials, because they all bring up different operational challenges. And
Yeah.
I am definitely one of those operations nerds that really leans into the opportunity to solve unique challenges in clinical operations.
Yes, and I think that's exactly what got us on the same kind of plate per se, because both of us are very heavily knee deep in operations, and I think we both consider ourselves um, experts in ops as well as solution providers. We fix things, we take care of the challenges. And I have a feeling for me, the same for you. When there's an issue, there's a challenge, there's a problem, you get called to come in and work it out and come up with a viable solution that's not only fixes the current issue, but is sustainable and gives us practical ways to move forward and not continue the cycle of the same issues over and over again.
It's such a good call out, Melody, because that's one of the things I actually like to do the most. It's one of the things I would consider a superpower. I think one thing that tends to get lost when we think about clinical trials is we have so many different stakeholders. We have sites, we have CROs and other vendors, we have sponsors, but really, coming all the way back to first principles, our North Star should be the patient. And I
Yes.
think for all of us working in clinical trials, we know that. We know that that patient is what we should be focused on. But all of these different stakeholders have different angles of looking at that problem and therefore different ways to attempt to solve it. And what we often miss is opportunities to bring all of those stakeholders to the table and think collectively about how to move a trial forward. These different viewpoints can really get in our way. The site
Mhm.
doesn't always know what the sponsor is after. The CRO sometimes gets this middleman position where they're trying to please everyone. And if we don't stop and think about how we'll work together as a
Mhm.
team, and I mean, not just as cross functional teams
Right.
within each different group, but really as a team across the entire trial, that's where we often see this chaos that you and I have kind of leaned into here.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think most of us in operations are too familiar with chaos. and it starts from, if this makes sense, before the beginning. A lot of times
Yeah.
we think we're at the beginning, but we really aren't. And so rethinking how we start and when we
Yeah.
bring the stakeholders in and how we communicate and make sure everyone understands each perspective and what the goal is, what is most important, what is the North Star for each of us so that we can work together. And so I would love to kind of understand how you calm the chaos because we all experience it. It leads to
Mhm.
so many things. I mean, it touches all the challenges that we find ourselves in with many of our trials, the people issues, burnout, um, quiet quitting, and folks not really committing themselves because the chaos is just so overwhelming that they kind of give up quietly.
Sure.
And so there's just
Mhm.
so many pieces to this chaos that we can prevent, right? We totally can prevent
Absolutely.
that continues to happen.
So there's a couple of things that come to mind here for me, Melody. And obviously we have a lot of different cases scenarios that we look at. But if we start at the very, very beginning and we set our trial up right, this is the ideal time to have those conversations before there is a final protocol. When we talk about, or when you mention beyond the protocol, that brings up so much for me because I think of that protocol as that true foundational document for our trial. But the reality is, so many of our stakeholders often aren't even part of the development process
Yes,
for that document.
very true.
And we're operating off of something that may have been finalized and we're now reacting to it. So already, if that's the case, we've set ourselves back. Because if
Mhm.
if we're reacting to it, and by we I mean the sites, the CRO, or even the operations team at the sponsor or other functional groups at the sponsor, we're already behind the 8 ball in
Yes.
terms of, how to come to the trial without that chaos.
Yes.
My belief is that the earlier we involve those stakeholders and the more proactive we are about having true relationships that are built before the protocol, behind the protocol, during protocol development, then we can really arrive at a protocol that not only is operationally feasible, but that everyone has bought into. And by everyone, again, I don't mean just everyone at the sponsor. I mean
Yes.
the CRO. I mean representatives from some of the clinical sites. I mean KOLs. I mean patient advocacy groups. I mean,
Yes.
really leaning into how many different angles there are to look at this protocol. And I know that as a CRC, I read the protocol one way. What is my job and what do I have to do? And can I do it? As a CRA coming into a site, it's okay, here's the protocol. What is the site doing with that? So it's really
Yes.
important to align all of our stakeholders up front. And that to me is how we reduce that initial chaos that can happen. Now, the other thing that happens, Melody, is you have a trial that's been kicked off, a protocol that's been finalized, a CRO that's been selected. The train has left the station, and that's a
Yes.
lot of a lot of the we often see chaos when that happens too. Um, a lot of reasons for that to happen. Sometimes we have executive teams at sponsors who they're raising funds. They need a quote. They go directly to a CRO. They get one, but they haven't developed any internal operational expertise.
Right.
Um, uh, Often we seek out some feedback from KOLs when we're developing protocols, but are those the people who are really going to be at the sites that are going to enroll the trial? Have we reached out to community sites? Have we reached out to coordinators? Have we spoken with patient advocacy groups? We look to KOLs as the experts, and they absolutely are experts in their field, but they play a role in the execution of that protocol. Um, and then you have a CRO that's sort of responsible to be that first line of contact between the site and that protocol. But we treat training as static. We give them, hundreds and hundreds of PowerPoint slides and we hope for the best. And maybe we have some meetings here or there, but we're starting off on the wrong foot. And so often when that chaos starts to build, it's quiet chaos. It's emails that aren't returned on time because we don't always know the answers to
Right.
respond to those emails, and we're having to escalate and troubleshoot and adjust internally. We're being asked questions that we didn't think about going into it because we didn't take the time necessarily that we needed to really think through what could come up once that protocol was launched and live at a site. So
I
the oh yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say you hit a pain point for me, training. I think training is, so overlooked from the beginning internally with our sites, with our CRO and vendor partners. Um, Even realizing that many of our vendor partners that build for us systems and platforms and the tools that we use, oftentimes they don't get any training on the protocol, which is amazing to me, but we need them to build our database or the platforms and tools that our sites will use in support of implementing the protocol. So I think training is something that is definitely a bridge that is broken, and it leads to a lot of the chaos that we have because we just overlook it. And like you say, throwing slide decks at everyone and getting them to do a read and receipt in a CTMS system or a
Yeah.
SOP system doesn't that just isn't training at
That's
all.
right. That's right. And I've actually written quite a bit about the training systems that we have in place and how they're broken. We really work off of an archaic methodology, and there are I think some really interesting new technologies, some companies that are really trying to solve the problem of training, and I'm really excited to see where that goes. But the reality is that we all need the same depth of training. We all need to make sure that we're looking at all of the different pieces. I'll take your vendor example a step further, Melody, in that I know that some folks at some of these vendor companies, they're tech companies. They have tech PMs that are brought in. They may not know GCP. They may not
Mhm.
know clinical trial operations at all. So,
Right.
do we understand who's on our teams? Do we understand their background, their education, their training, their understanding of clinical trials in general? This specific protocol, this therapy area, there are so many nuances across all of these different things, and we make a lot of assumptions.
We do.
And then there's an issue of ownership. Well, if the CRO contracts with the vendor, do they train the vendor? Does the sponsor train the vendor? And do we even have a conversation about whose responsibility that is?
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
we sort of get on autopilot. We know what we need to do. We know that we need regulatory approval. We know we need contracts in place. We have all of these boxes that we check on our SOPs, but that's the issue. SOPs don't equal an operationally sound trial. SOPs don't get us through that chaos because they're static documents. And if we're
Right.
not reading them, if we're not following them, if we're not designing them in a way that fits what we're actually executing against, then we're leaving a lot on the table.
I fully agree with you. And I think the SOPs serve a purpose, but they don't serve the purpose of helping us run trials in an efficient, optimal way. And not even from a compliance perspective, because oftentimes we write the SOPs in such a way that they can be interpreted and we don't put ourselves into a box where we're consistently out of compliance. So to rely on an SOP to help us guide ourselves through what we should be doing is just not a good plan. I don't have a better way to say it. Just not a good plan.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, we have to look at the actual flow of work. An
Yes.
SOP is only as good as the workflow that it mirrors. And if your team can't or won't follow that process, well, you're out of compliance already. But again, I'll take it a step back. Are we using the CRO's SOPs? Are we using the sponsor's SOPs? Sometimes the sponsor has some SOPs, but not all. But how are we defining what our operational process really is? And are we
Mm.
clear on those details? Because
Oftentimes
we
the
end
answer is
up
no. It's
that's
often no.
exactly right.
Yeah.
And if we have a small team, that might be something that we can sit down and have a meeting about. Think of a phase 3 trial where you have teams spread across the globe. You have cultural differences. You have
Mhm.
language barriers. You have time zone barriers. It's
Yes.
really tough to make sure that that entire team is crystal clear on what you're trying to accomplish. We have conflicting timelines. The CRO is going to give you a baseline, there are so many times that we're so quick to look at first patient in that we're not really evaluating if the timeline we're operating off is 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 aligned with what our goals are as a sponsor, as a partnership, or as a program. So there are a lot of opportunities, but it really takes that solid footing before the protocol to really be successful. And if we don't get that, we then really have to kind of go back to basics. If we find ourselves in that spot of chaos, it's going back to the protocol. It's going back to the contract that we have with the CRO and maybe those subcontracted vendors. It's going back to the sites and making sure that expectations are really clear across, again, all stakeholders. If we're not
Yes.
working towards the same goal because we don't know what those goals are, chaos is going to continue to swirl in the background. And we're all going to wonder because we all come with our own perspectives. So,
Yes.
again, making sure that the sites are really crystal clear on what you want and they know how to do it. Sites have so many responsibilities, they have so many trials. They often have trials that compete with each other. If they don't know where you fit or how to accomplish something or how to get it done, they're gonna move on. They're gonna do the
They
best
do.
they can with what
Mhm.
they have, but think of how many documents a site has to digest. They have a protocol, they have an investigator's brochure, a lab manual, a pharmacy manual, the
Yes.
list goes on. They may
Yes.
have one person, a coordinator, who's responsible for making sure that all of that is executed, and that coordinator, of course, has multiple projects. So we
Yes.
need to make this information easy to find. And ultimately, that protocol is the North Star for everything that trickles down from it. But there are so many opportunities during that process of additional document creation where, gosh, we might end up with something that conflicts. And then how do
Yeah.
we fix that? How do we stop that gap before we actually have a problem?
Agree. And I think I know what I shout from the mountaintops from my perspective is people, culture, and processes, and in that order. And I think sometimes if we could get to basics and focus on that, it would help us tremendously because we all know at the end of the day, from our site staff perspective, our study coordinator and our investigators, the sponsors and the CROs that are able to have the least chaos and to be the most organized and efficient in how they conduct the trials and what they're asking the sites to do, those are the studies that get the priority. They get the focus.
100%.
And so I think it's a downstream implication when you operate in chaos and you don't find ways to fix that. And then you
And the
wonder why
main
trials are
reason
in the state that they're in, right?
The main reason I really think that happens, Melody, and I 100% agree with you, but you have a CRO that has their own internal processes, their own internal SOPs, their own internal infrastructure, their own internal management system, and they're operating
In a
to their
silo.
spec
Yeah,
in,
they
in
operate
their
in a
silo.
silo that doesn't connect to the
Exactly.
sponsor silo, right?
Exactly.
And then the sites
Exactly.
are expected to support 2 silos for 1
And
study.
so that's why 100%, and that's why I advocate that CROs and sponsors have to form partnerships.
Yes.
Yes, the sponsor is ultimately responsible for the trial. And yes, the CRO is a hired service provider. But if we
Mhm.
don't act as a team and we don't establish that team mentality and culture, to your point, which I just love that you called out culture up front, there's always going to be friction. There will always be a
Mhm.
lack of alignment problems to solve. But if we have that foundation and we trust each other and we know what each other is trying to accomplish and how we're going to go about doing that, that decreases the noise significantly. I really like teams to feel empowered to talk to each other, to break down those barriers, to get to know each other,
Yes.
to understand who that person is beyond what their job title is. There can be so much friction on calls between sponsor teams and CRO
Mhm.
teams, but that friction's there because somewhere along the line expectations weren't managed or
Right.
weren't weren't lined out. Transparency is incredibly important, And within sponsor teams, it's making sure that the expectations uh, of the executive team, of the investors, are managed internally as well. Your operations team of the sponsor has to work with the chief medical officer, with the CEO, with that internal team to manage expectations. And that's why I really advocate that, number one, sponsor teams bring in operational experts early, and operational experts that have a real senior level of expertise to really think about strategy. We don't want to think about what could go wrong tomorrow, because if it's going to go wrong tomorrow, the problem already exists. We
Right.
really want to think way out into the future about what
Downstream.
downstream could happen. And it does
Mhm.
take some experience to be able to do that. And again, to think about your stakeholders. How does this impact the CRO? How does this impact the site? And of course, as sponsors, we want to deliver for our executive teams. We want to deliver for our investors, but we have to be operating against something that's operationally sound, that's feasible, budgets
Mhm.
and timelines that we know we can meet. And again, that's why it's really tricky to just of course we're rushing towards first patient in. It's an incredible milestone, but the more important milestone in my opinion is last patient out. We have to get through that trial. And if we're stuck on getting the first patient in and how fast we can do it, we may be missing opportunities to make it easier downstream to get to that last patient. Because ultimately, we're not going to conclude this trial until we have a data readout. And that data readout is going to define how that clinical development program moves forward one way or another. We need to be focused on finishing the trial, not just starting
Yeah.
it.
So one of the reasons why I was really excited that you agreed to join me and be a guest today is because you have insight or perspective from the C-suite. And so, from the viewpoint of executive leadership, you've been in those roles, you've supported companies and been part of the direction and strategy a company goes and how they run trials from that position or that level. And so I want to ask you, because this is a discussion I have frequently with colleagues and people that I meet in the industry. What can our executive leaders do? The folks that aren't so close to the day-to-day operations and challenges. And they're getting the output, they're getting the status updates, and they're keeping a pulse on how we're doing. And oftentimes they hear the challenges that are happening, even more so than possibly the victories and the wins. So, what can executive leadership do to help calm the chaos that we're talking about? What are some strategies and things that you feel that level can do to help ease these pain points we're talking about today?
So there's a couple of buckets that I'm going to call out here. And some of them are going to feel obvious, but we're moving really fast and they often come they often break down along the way. The first one is communication. Our executive teams need to communicate their expectations very clearly, but they also need to be receptive to feedback. Sometimes there are barriers within trials where timelines or budgets slip, and there are real reasons why this happens. And if we keep kind of bumping up against our executive team, we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So operations needs to be able to have those conversations with the executive team, and they need to be able to translate what the team is experiencing. The reality is execs are really busy and they're not in those weeds. So they want high level information in terms of what's going right, what's going wrong, and why, and what the downstream impact of that is going to be. So
Mhm.
they need to communicate with their teams. We need as much transparency across the different levels as we can get. Now, I know that that is tricky. And I know that sometimes that means slowing down to go fast, but making sure that the team, not just the team leader or the head of clinical
Right.
operations or the
That's the
CMO
key.
knows what
Yeah.
what is being asked, but that the whole operations team knows what's being asked and how it impacts them. I think we can often be in our own little silos too. A CTM can be in a silo. This is my work stream. This is what I need to get done. But if they understand how what they're doing impacts the overall trial, therefore impacts the company, they're going to feel a lot more ownership towards what they're
Mhm.
doing. And so I
I
really like to build a culture of transparency and clarity to the extent possible. And then for the execs that don't necessarily know the details of trial operations, making sure that we can all get in a room and provide that feedback that they need in order to sort of see what's happening and educate them as to some of the hurdles that happen. A lot of our execs didn't grow up as CTAs and CTMs. They didn't work at CROs. They're brilliant leaders. They're brilliant scientists. They're brilliant physicians. But
Right.
operations is so nuanced. And, I think that's why it's so important that operations has a seat at the table, a seat in the room. And it's important that that operator can translate what is happening in the weeds to what an executive needs to hear and needs to see. And ultimately, what
I
they really want to
so
know,
agree.
go ahead, Melody, please.
I so agree with that. And there are so many times that I have been bought in on the back end when things have gone really, really wrong. And it's a result of decisions being made up front. And the ClinOps team or representation or leadership from ClinOps wasn't part of those discussions and that strategy and decisions. And so we assume that a process can happen like that, or it costs this much, or we only need these many people, or it's very simple to do XYZ. And so we can have a first patient in 60 days because we've already done a similar study. And so the team can just wash, rinse, and repeat, and everything will be good. And so I think when you say a seat at the table, that is it's so true. And oftentimes ops is overlooked when the
Yeah,
decision making
that's
and the
right.
strategy, and we're just considered the workhorses and we just implement, but we shouldn't just be the implementation team. We should be part of the planning and strategy. And when that happens,
100%.
it's so much better every time.
100%. I've had the luck of being surrounded by some really brilliant leaders who understand how important clinical operations is, and they bring you into the room. They help amplify your voice. And by doing that, they help make sure that alignment is there, that communication is there, and that communication is upwards and downwards, and that we can fill in those blanks. It's great when senior leadership recognizes how much clinical operations has to juggle and to worry about, and how nuanced it is. And even if they don't know those nuances themselves, again, making sure that they're having the right conversations with the right people. That could be a skip level. That could be the CEO meeting with the head of ClinOps, who may be reporting to the CMO. It could be expanding the leadership team so that VPs or SVPs or heads of departments have opportunities to present. Now, they're going to also need to refine that presentation for an executive audience. It is different to present to an executive audience than it is to present to folks that are in the trenches, to your clinical operations team, to even the CRO's team, because those folks are in it. You would have to translate that into sort of that high level actions and high level consequences, but we also have to be prepared to bring those executives solutions. They want to know what's going right, they want to know what's going wrong, but they also want someone who can come to the table and say, here's how we can get ourselves back on track. Here's how we can do better for our next trial. And so that seat at the table, regardless of whether that person sits on the C-suite team or is invited into the room by that leadership team,
Right.
that culture of transparency, of communication is so important. These
Yes.
clinical stage assets, when we get to the stage in our company where we have a clinical stage asset, all of these biotech companies, many of them are pre-revenue. Every dollar is so, so critical that we think through how it's spent and where it's spent. We don't want change orders. We don't want pivots. We don't want to rebuild systems. But
Right.
those changes that we may have casual conversations about over coffee may have really, really deep and expensive downstream impacts. So, the more transparency we can have across the board, the more communication we can have across the board, the more we can bring clinical operations into the room and really give them that seat at the table, we'll be set up for success better going into it. But when that chaos comes, we'll have someone who is able to navigate the ship and is trusted to help readjust where we need to.
Agree. I agree. I think that is so insightful and a good view into what doesn't happen, but also what can happen, right? So I kind of want to wrap us up and take us down the road of asking you, what does a high performing team look like to you? What is that in a dream world where you have a great team and these folks are getting it done in the way that can be a model for others to use?
Sure. So again, I think the first thing is an ecosystems thinking. It's thinking about the entire ecosystem of your trial, all of your stakeholders, everyone that is going to be involved in that, and thinking about it as an ecosystem, thinking about partnerships rather than contracts with CROs, with vendors, with sites, and really thinking about being intentional about communication and transparency. We talk about building culture internally at companies and CROs, sites, sponsors. They all want great culture, but culture goes beyond the culture at the sponsor, the culture at the CRO, and the culture at the site. It's the culture of the trial. And we
Yes.
want to build a culture of transparency, of 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 communication, of real ownership. And we want to empower our teams to feel like they are really part of helping move that engine forward. Um, I think that really making sure that the teams understand why the trial is so important, what's exciting about the mechanism of action, what's exciting about the therapy area, what the patients that are experiencing this condition are really going through, and why
Mhm.
it's so important to get better treatments to those patients. Why this trial? Why this team? I like to make sure that the CRO knows how amazing they're performing, why we chose them. I like those sites to know that we see them as true partners. I like to know who the coordinators are and the PIs. I like to make sure that when we have investigator meetings or times that we can come together in person, we're really able to shake hands and put faces to names and make meaningful connections. People need to feel like the work they're doing is part of something. People are working in this industry because they want to help patients. They want to
Right.
advance science and medicine. But if all you're doing is flipping one page over to the next and looking for uh, I's that haven't been dotted and T's that haven't been crossed, it's hard to see that what you're doing really makes a difference. And I think everyone needs to see that overall vision and feel like the work they're doing is really moving that needle.
I agree. I totally agree. Well, I think this has been an amazing discussion. I'm so glad you joined us today. And I think teams can really pause. It doesn't matter where you are in the trial, if you're at the beginning or in maintenance or you're wrapping up. It's never too late to try to find a way to calm the chaos, right?
It's
And get the
100%
partnership
true.
culture and try to make it better where we may have not done as great as we could have, but there's always opportunity to improve it and make it better. And I think a lot of
Always.
the things we've talked about today lend themselves to that completely. So thank you for joining.
My pleasure. I think there's always this desire to run, run, run to that next milestone, but sometimes slowing down and walking before we run is going to set us up for
It's
such
so
better
valuable.
success in the long run.
Yes.
And I think if everyone feels that they have a seat at the table and that the work they're doing matters, whether you are at a site, a CRO, a lab vendor, or a specialty vendor at the sponsor, regardless of what your title is or what your level is, everything you're doing is incredibly important and incredibly meaningful towards that trial and towards advancing that therapy.
It is.
And so if I could leave you with anything, it's that wherever you are in your journey, what you're doing matters. And the better we try to communicate that value across the entire team, the entire ecosystem that's participating in a trial, the more successful we're going to be.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Suzanne. This was awesome. I'd love to have you back. I think we could continue this conversation for hours.
I think you're right, Melanie. I guarantee you we could. I have so many notes here. Just thinking through, the different things that we talked about coming to this table. And you're right. I'd be more than thrilled to join you again.
Awesome. That sounds like a plan. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.